Earlier this year, my school informed me that we will be receiving comprehensive sex education in my junior year. At this point, both I and most of my peers have already had some kind of conversation surrounding sex, albeit a very limited conversation. I personally, and I'm sure most other people, have only had the talk about straight sex, or we have some pretty basic knowledge from here and there. At the very least, there is an infinite amount of information on the internet that is completely accessible for free. The point is, by now, we're in the know. Now, I do understand that I shouldn't put all the blame onto my school for the lack of quantity and quality in terms of sex education. In fact, they're pretty much exempt from blame. Individual public schools don't decide on legislature. In 2021, Arizona's House Bill 2035 was introduced by Representative Gail Griffin, requiring written parental permission from parents for their children to participate in sex education. And in public and charter schools, it prevents students in grades 1 through 5 from participating in any sex education at all. There's more details to this bill, but the rundown is: Arizona schools are not required to teach sex education or HIV education. If a school chooses to teach sex ed, it must stress abstinence. If sex ed is offered, curriculum is not required to include instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity. If sex ed is offered, curriculum is not required to include instruction on consent. Parental opt-in policy, like I said before. And if sex ed is offered, the curriculum must be medically accurate. Hopefully a bunch of sirens went blaring off in your head as I read out those requirements, as they did in mine when I first saw them. Unfortunately, these requirements are not unique to Orwellian AZ. In Alabama, HIV and STI education are the only ones that are mandated. Education must be medically accurate. No. Education must be culturally appropriate and unbiased. No. Education must cover abstinence. Yes, education must stress abstinence. Education must cover consent and healthy relationships. No. Education attitude towards LGBTQ identities. No mandate. Education attitude towards abortion. No mandate. Parental notice required? No. Parental consent required? No. In Michigan, mandated sex and HIV/STI education, HIV and STI education only. Education must be medically accurate. No. Education must be culturally appropriate and unbiased. No. Education must cover abstinence. Yes, education must stress abstinence. Education must cover consent and healthy relationships. No. Education attitude towards LGBTQ identities. No mandate. Education attitude towards abortion. Prohibit. Parental notice required, yes. Parental consent required, no. Opt-out allowed, yes. And, of course, Florida, though I'm sure these requirements will come as no surprise to anyone. Mandated sex and HIV/STI education, yes. Education must be medically accurate, no. Education must be culturally appropriate and unbiased, no. Education must cover abstinence. Yes, education must stress abstinence. Education must cover consent and healthy relationships. Healthy relationships only. Healthy relationships, but no consent. Okay. Education attitude towards LGBTQ+ identities. Discriminatory. Education attitude toward abortion. No mandate. Parental notice required, no. Parental consent required, no. Opt-out allowed, yes. The abhorrent state of America's sex education is not limited to these states, of course. Even though there are minute differences in legalities from state to state, for the entirety of the U.S., the sex curriculum is mainly driven by an anti-LGBTQ and generally anti-sex agenda, excluding the few states who are trying to make sex education more inclusive and better. In order to have control over our bodies, Republican legislatures use incredibly effective fear-mongering tactics. There is no scientific or moral basis behind the educational limits and discriminatory instruction I listed before. They are solely based on fear and hatred, not the safety and betterment of kids' lives as they mature and grow. This hyperactive anxiety surrounding children's sex education is a satanic panic of its own. In the Moral Panics of Sexuality chapter, Bodies That Are Out of Line, the pure and innocent child is critical to the information of the good, moral, heteronormative adult citizen. Children's access to sexual knowledge before it is considered to be developmentally appropriate, discursively defined within a moral, Christian, heteronormative framework, is perceived as corrupting the child's innocence and potentially leading to children's promiscuity and immature sexual activity. Because sexuality is already condemned in adulthood, conservative moguls create discourse on protecting innocence and children's vulnerability in order to uphold these barriers to adequate sex ed. One phrase that I may have mentioned before, which is applicable to this method of prevention, is age appropriate. Don't get me wrong, some things kids shouldn't see quite yet, but when it comes to basic health education, come on. Age appropriate is oftentimes a pretty malevolent and conniving term, as it demands that we don't ask too much about what it actually means. In using it, one assumes that everyone around them knows what appropriate is, and it signals that there is something inappropriate/dangerous that must be actively avoided. By labeling anything as age appropriate or inappropriate, the intended and implicit result is putting whatever thing is age appropriate beyond the scope of critique. It's the exact same kind of argument that a lot of religious zealots use. You can't question my belief because this is just the way God intended it. There's no room for discussion or adjustment. Judith Levine argues in Harmful to Minors, appropriateness as an idea assumes and pays homage to an omniscient arbiter of right and wrong, an arbiter who is nameless and formless, and as a result, even more powerful in its declarations of appropriate and inappropriate. This rhetoric isn't limited to sex education. Bigoted movements use age appropriate against the entirety of the LGBTQ's existence, for example, from media representations of queer people to hormone therapy. Honestly, the same goes for people of color. The new Little Mermaid movie, for example, has seen an unbelievable onslaught of racism and hysteria, solely because a black woman is playing Ariel. And although with race, people don't as often come out and directly say they don't want their kids seeing black people on the big screens, the sentiment is still there. Identifying representation, whether it's through education or pop culture, as unsuitable for kids maliciously excludes itself from critical thinking. And it insinuates that people of color, a slew of kinds of women, and LGBTQ+ identities are inherently deviant and inappropriate. The desire is to prevent these identities from existing at all, or if they do exist, then to make that existence unbearable and incredibly difficult. Sex education and education in general is probably the most effective way at pushing certain identities out of the mainstream and pushing for these bigoted views. And this book burning kind of attitude towards education is the exact same rhetoric that we saw happening in Nazi Germany. So although this is a pretty dark conversation to have, and the future is looking pretty grim at the moment, there are still things that we can do to try to help. So I'm going to put several links to petitions or places you can support and donate in the description box below. Well, I will leave you with that. See you next time.